Well, good morning, everyone, to this morning's Audit Committee for our fiscal year 2021. My name is Stéphane Tifo. I'm the Clerk of the County of Lambton. I will be briefly chairing this meeting until such time as the committee has appointed its own chair. I do wish to acknowledge the presence and welcome as well our County of Lambton auditors, Mr. Pete Barnes and Jordan Rudanycz. Welcome. So that being said, we'll start with the first order of business, which is the roll call. Councillor Arnold. Thank you. Councillor Loosely.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Stark.
Present.
Warden Marriott. And Deputy Warden Bev Hand. And Ms. Hand sent in her regrets, but we do have a quorum. First item of, or second item of business, selection of a committee chair. Do we have a mover nomination for one of you to chair today's meeting? Councillor Stark.
I nominate Warden Marriott.
Warden Marriott, do you accept that nomination? Thank you. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Loosely, all in favor? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tifo. So let's see here. I guess we go right to the auditors. I see we have Mr. Pete Barnes and Mr. Jordan. I don't want to butcher his last name.
It's Rudanycz.
Okay, there we go. That's perfect. So I'll turn it over to you, gentlemen. Who would like to go first?
So I'm just going to share my screen there just so we can kind of go through that there. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep, I can see it, Jordan.
Yep. Everybody else, we're good? Okay.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. As Warden Marriott mentioned, my name's Pete Barnes. I'm a partner at BDO here in Sarnia. And Jordan Rudanycz, he's an audit manager in our office, and he's worked on the county file for a number of years now. So I'm just going to give you a quick update on the status. Once the draft statements are approved, we need to complete subsequent events work up to today's date, receive back a response to our fraud letter, which I saw was in the agenda, and then receive back our management representation letter, which I sent out to Nancy and Larry this morning. So you want to roll the slide there, Jordan?
Oh, yep. Sorry.
So this is what, okay, next one. So this is what we're going to cover today. Jordan's going to go through the highlights from the statements, and then I'll go over the final report to those charged with governance and the management letter. So when you see in a second when Jordan goes through the slides, the county had another strong financial year. So I'll turn it over to Jordan now.
All right. Thanks, Pete. All right. Yeah. So again, I'm Jordan Rudanycz. Been involved in the County of Lambton audit for a number of years there. To get started and looking at your financial statement package, we're going to take a look at the independent audit report, which is on page 25 of your agenda package. Overall, it details that for the Corporation of the County of Lambton, the company and consolidated financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the municipality as at December 31st, 2021, and its consolidated results of operations, its consolidated change in net financial assets debt, and its consolidated cash flows for the year that ended in accordance with Canadian public sector accounting standards. So in other words, that's a clean opinion. It's a consistent opinion for the County of Lambton. The independent audit report is unchanged from the prior year. Turn the slide here. So when looking at your financial statements and at this presentation, there's going to be two main statements that we'll focus in on. The first being the consolidated statement of financial position, and the second being the consolidated statement of operations, which is the income statement. For the consolidated statement of financial position, we'll focus in on financial assets, financial liabilities, as well as long-term debt. And then looking at the statement of operations, we'll look at revenue and expenses at greater depth. So this slide here shows your financial assets and its trends over the past 3 years. Overall, you can see that the County of Lambton has been building its asset base over the past 3 years. Overall, assets have built by about $31.8 million, or 49%, when compared with 2019. And most of that increase is focused in on cash and temporary investments as well as accounts receivable. The increase in accounts receivable during the year is mainly as a result of timing of receipt and activity at the end of the year. Some of the notable increases in accounts receivable come from the City of Sarnia for taxation revenue, as well as receivables from housing and social services for capital projects that were underway or were completed at and around year-end. The increase in cash is detailed on the cash flow statement of the financial statement package, or page 30 of your agenda package. And looking at that statement, you'll see that the cash balance has increased mainly as a result of the annual surplus generated during the year, offset by the purchase of tangible capital assets, as well as repayment of long-term debt. Let's flip the slide here. So this slide, it shows financial liabilities and its trends over the past 3 years. Overall, you can see it's been relatively consistent. Next slide. Long-term debt. Overall, the slide shows long-term debt and its trends over the past 5 years. From 2020 to 2021, the long-term debt has decreased to $2.6 million, or 7.8%. Next slide. This slide shows long-term debt and principal repayments expected in the future for years 2022 to 2026. The expected principal repayments are expected to be $13.9 million. The long-term debt and its note can be found in note 7 of your financial statement package, or on pages 35 and 36 of the agenda in front of you. So this slide shows total accumulated surplus and tangible capital assets over the past 3 years. For 2021, accumulated tangible capital assets amount to $288 million. And for accumulated surplus, it's over $319 million. The breakdown of the municipality's tangible capital assets is on Schedule 1 of the financial statement package, or on pages 48 to 51 of the agenda that you have in front of you. For the accumulated surplus, that's on Schedule 2 of your financial statement package, and that's just after the capital asset schedule on page 52 of the agenda. So this slide shows our reserve and reserve funds and its trends over the past 5 years. From 2017 to 2021, reserves have increased $31.3 million. From 2020 to 2021, $7.96 million has been added to the reserve and reserve funds. So this slide shows revenues compared budgeted to actual. Overall, you can see that actual revenues are greater than budgeted by nearly $15.1 million, or a difference of 6.83%. Most of the difference from budgeted to actual comes from additional provincial government transfers greater than budgeted. Most of that increase comes from additional funding flowed to the municipality through Safe Start refunds, COVID-19 funding, and social services relief funding. This slide shows revenue broken down in a pie chart format. Overall, you can see that over 48% of revenue comes from provincial government transfers, nearly 36% comes from taxation revenue, and 11% from user charges. This slide here shows expenses broken down by function. Overall, you can see that actual expenses are a little bit greater than budgeted by about nearly $5.2 million, or a difference of 2.42%. That's fairly close. Just turn the slide here. The next slide breaks down expenses by object, which is on note 11 of your financial statement package, or page 37 of the agenda. Overall, you can see that when comparing expenses from the current year to prior year, most are relatively consistent with the prior year, with the exception of salaries, wages, and benefits, materials, and contributions to other organizations. Salaries, wages, and benefits are greater than the prior year, mainly as a result of COVID-19, the COVID-19 vaccination programs and clinics, and the overtime that was needed to staff those programs, as well as a general increase in services from COVID-19 restrictions easing in 2021. Materials expenses have increased when compared to prior year, and that's mainly as a result of inflation and increases in cost per unit for materials purchased. Contributions to other organizations are less than last year, mainly as a result of decreases due to the decline in Ontario Works caseloads. Next pie chart relates to breaks down expenses by object in a pie chart format. You can see that about nearly 42% of expenses come from salaries, wages, and benefits, over 31% from materials, and 12.8% for contributions to other organizations. This slide here just highlights some notes in your financial statement package. The first one being Note 8, the pension agreement related to OMERS. It details that amounts contributed to the OMERS pension plan this year amounts to $5.6 million versus last year's $5.5. The next note to highlight is Note 18, the SWIFT loan guarantee, which is on page 44 of your package. It details that the municipality has guaranteed the SWIFT credit facility in the amount of $2.1 million. And then finally, the last note to highlight is Note 19 for various commitments that the municipality has related to rentals, maintenance of roads, construction projects, and grants. The next slide here highlights the trust fund, which is on page 59 of your agenda package. It is a separate set of statements from the county's main audit statements. The trust fund has received an unqualified audit report, just like the County of Lambton's main statements, and details total assets and a fund balance of nearly $84,000. Now, just the next slide, I'll pass it back to Pete to discuss the final report to those charged with governance.
Thanks, Jordan. So each year we're required to issue a final report to those charged with governance, which is you as an audit committee. It's a follow-up to our planning report, which was provided before the audit started. A copy is in your agenda package starting on page 68. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the key points that we're required to discuss with the audit committee. So we're required to update our independence since the last date of our last letter, which was April 4th, 2022. So we can confirm that we're still independent with respect to the county as of today. We also need to disclose if there were any changes to our materiality, and materiality did not change. It remained at $4.5 million. We also need to disclose if we discovered any unadjusted misstatements. And this year we're pleased again to note that there were none, similar to last year. I've already talked about the management rep letter, how we need that signed and returned before we can release financial statements. So the last thing I was going to talk about is our draft management letter, which is also in your package starting on page 81. So this was reviewed with management. And on page 83 is where we discuss our points. So I'll briefly go through those now. So the first points we had were in relation to the nursing homes. It was noted at one home, there was one instance out of the sample we tested where a copy of the receipt for a trust deposit wasn't being kept at the home. This is a similar error that was noted again last year. And then the other point relates to documentation surrounding missing power of attorney forms, inconsistencies with point-click care, or ones that did not have an appropriate signature. Again, these are similar points to what we encountered last year. And then there are a couple points in the information technology environment that we discovered. The first one relates to revoking terminated users on a timely basis. And the other one deals with changes to the password complexity requirements. And these points have been discussed with Rob Wilkes for his consideration. So finally, that's all we have. We'd like to thank Larry, Nancy, and their staff for their help to make the audit smooth again this year. And we're open for any questions.
Thank you for that, Jordan and Pete. Are there any questions from Councillor Stark, please?
Yes, thank you very much for your report. I have two questions, and one is a general question, which you don't cover in your audit, but it's a question that I posed to our treasurer, and I wondered if you have any comments or positions as it relates to whether or not there should be a mechanism to determine when long-term debt is incurred. Is there a threshold that we should be considering as to what level should be considered long-term? What is the triggering mechanism, or do you suggest a triggering mechanism?
So the ministry, when you file your financial information return, they calculate what the maximum debt capacity the county can handle is, which I think Nancy gets a copy of each year after we file the FIR. So that is basically the maximum that the county could take out. I think it's up to each individual council how much debt up to that point they would like to incur. I don't know if that answers your question, or?
Well, not really. What I'm asking for is your recommendation as to whether or not we should employ some kind of a triggering mechanism. If it's a $10 million issue, or if it's a $5 million issue, or at what point do you recommend a triggering amount as to whether or not we should incur long-term debt?
I don't know if there's necessarily a triggering amount. I think you have to look at what, the interest rates are at, how much cash you have that might be available, and how much, you want to increase your budget each year to meet those needs. Like, I don't think there's a dollar amount that necessarily is a trigger. If you can get debt at a good rate, that's probably a wise move.
Thank you. And one other question dealt with the materiality, and it was a $4.5 million amount, and it appears on page 1 in terms of the general category. I need further explanation as to what does this, it's an odd amount, 4.5, like where does that come from, or what does that represent?
Jordan, do you want to handle that?
Yep, I'm just pulling up materiality right now. So we use a benchmark when we determine materiality. I believe it's based on expenses for the County of Lambton, and why we choose expenses as a materiality benchmark, and then we apply a chosen factor, like an proven chosen factor that you can use. So in this case for the county, you have expenses of like almost $200 million, and then you apply a chosen factor of 2.5%, and that will give you materiality. And what that is you comes up with a number of where users' decisions will be effective if the statements are misstated by greater than that figure. So with materiality, it's a number that we come up with to make sure that, if the statements are misstated by greater than this number, then your decisions will start to be affected. And it's and the base that we use and the percentage that we apply against that is consistent that we've been using over the past number of years, and is, I think, consistent across most municipalities in coming up with that materiality figure.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councillor Arnold.
Thank you, Warden Marriott. Just to follow up a little bit on Councillor Stark, I think that if we wanted to put in a debt trigger, that would be a council policy decision for a financial end. And if we wanted to give guidance or suggestion, a motion of council or a recommendation from this group would be appropriate, I would think, Warden. But yeah, that's something we could do if that's what Councillor Stark wanted to see in place. But that'd be up to us as elected folks to make that decision.
Councillor Stark.
I appreciate that comment, and in fact, I do believe that we as a council should be doing that. I think Mr. Pilarchio responded to a question that I posed some time ago in this regard, and it's simply asking the auditors if they can give us some advice. That's the issue.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, Councillor Loosely, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm sure it's going to be completed, but just to follow up with administration that they look into these recommendations to make sure we try and correct them in the future. Thank you.
One last chance for questions. Seeing none, we'll move on to items for consideration. The 2021 Consolidated Financial Statements and Reports.
I just suggest if there are any questions specifically on any one of those reports. I know that the auditors have gone through them, but if there are questions on specific reports, then perhaps now the opportunity.
Thanks for that, Mr. Tifo. So no questions on item A? How about item B? And then item C, further discussion. So that brings us to number 5, the recommendations.
That'll get us, based on what I've seen and observed in terms of the discussion, that'll get us to 4C, if the committee wishes to get to 4C. And if so, we will exclude management from the room at this point in time.
Okay, so I guess we're at that point then. Oh. Okay. Yeah.
For those of you following us online, the Audit Committee is entering into a private discussion with the auditors on any matters that they wish to discuss vis-a-vis the management of the County of Lambton. As a result of that, it is a in-camera discussion. We will therefore be closing the feed and not returning. So we thank you for following us online this morning.